Hi, this is Allison Liu, and I am doing lecture 2 in Human Nutrition, Wellness, and Safety, which is Public Health 100 at Carolina University. So last time we talked about basic nutrition information. We talked about the difference between wellness and health. We talked about macronutrients and micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, which are also called fats. We talked about how nutritional status is measured and the weaknesses of some of those measures. We also delved into the human body, especially the digestive system and how that works, its structure and function. So now we're going to talk about water a little more, water in the body. We touched on it a little bit last time when we talked about that most of our bodies is made of water. So water is essential to life. The right amount of water is necessary for the body's optimum performance. Remember how much of it is water. So let's talk for a few minutes about a story that I think is kind of interesting. It's about the University of Florida Gators back in the 1960s. They were practicing and playing games in the very humid, hot Florida climate. And the football players were having a hard time with that. They were developing a lot of heat-related illness and kind of wilting in the Florida sun. They just couldn't practice and play as long as they needed to really reach their goals as a team. So they asked the University of Florida scientists to study heat-related illness in the players and try to figure out what was going on and prevent it. So what did the UF scientists find? They found that inadequate replacement of water and electrolytes and carbohydrates was what was causing the problem. And they tried to develop a solution called Gatorade. They invented Gatorade to help, and the Florida Gators football team soon won the Orange Bowl, which is a really big deal. So Gatorade became a household name. Many other teams were asking for it. Athletes were wanting to use it to help them in the same ways the UF team was using it to recover faster, practice longer, play longer and harder. And so it just became a very lucrative business and a very famous product. So now that we've talked about how Gatorade was helpful to this team and became very popular, let's talk for a minute, though, about kind of the downside, which is that we are not all college football players practicing for hours and hours in the hot Florida sun and sweating out a lot of sweat that, we'll need to replace the electrolytes we're losing. We're not mostly doing that, but yet we are consuming a lot of sugary drinks with and without electrolytes in them. Things like Coca-Cola are ones without electrolytes. And those drinks can contribute to America's problems with heart disease, type 2 diabetes, dental problems, and obesity, and likely do. There's a lot of sugary drinks that are being consumed and, without really a good purpose behind that necessarily. Now, I like Gatorade. I think a lot of people like Gatorade. And when we talk about nutrition, we always want to talk about balance and, having some of those foods that we like and enjoy, and I just want to point out, though, that I'm not saying in this story about Gatorade that I think Gatorade is something we should be consuming on a daily basis in large quantities. But it is a great story about learning through science about a problem and trying to solve it and coming up with a product that has been used to help some athletes really achieve longer practice times and things like that. But it's also become a consumer product that not all of us need to be drinking that are drinking them in the quantities we are drinking it. All right, so back to human beings and water. Human beings are mostly water. And the water, quote unquote, in our bodies isn't exactly pure water, right? It's mixed with many things, including the electrolytes that we were mentioning are in Gatorade. Some other components are lipoproteins, glucose, proteins, and cells. So let's go ahead and define electrolytes, because I've just been kind of throwing that term around, talking about Gatorade and not really defining it. So let's get down to what it really is. Electrolytes are substances that, when dissolved in water, dissociate into charged ions. So we have positively charged ions that are called cations, and negatively charged positively charged electrolytes that are called cations, and negatively charged electrolytes that are called anions. Okay, so an example of an electrolyte is sodium chloride, and you'll find that in the products that are used to replace electrolytes in drink form. You'll find that they contain this. It's also called table salt, sodium chloride. In water, sodium chloride, the chemical name for table salt, it dissociates into sodium cations and chloride anions. Okay, so what is a solute after all? And this is getting into a little more chemistry. We're doing a little chemistry at the beginning of this lecture. A solute refers to all dissolved substances in a fluid, which may be charged, such as sodium, or may be uncharged, such as glucose. So it's the dissolved substances in the fluid, okay? So when we talk about our bodies and water, I want you to consider for a moment that if we didn't have kind of boundaries within our bodies that contained water or kept water in certain parts and not in other parts, then we would kind of be like a water balloon. We'd be like a blob, and we would be surrounded by some kind of exterior, and then inside just be a whole lot of water, 62% or so of water. And, you know, some other things in there too, but it'd be a lot of water and we kind of be a blob. But we actually do have a lot of boundaries for where water and solutes are distributed in our body, okay? So inside the cells is called the intracellular fluid, okay? So inside the cells. So we saw a model of a cell last time. We saw it two times. We thought it was so important that it was in there 2 times. So that fluid that's in those cells is intracellular fluid. And then outside of the cells, we have the extracellular fluid. So the extracellular fluid's outside the cells. So when we were talking before about prefixes and how those can help you in science and nutrition, intra means inside, extra means outside. So just remember those prefixes if you can, and use them to remember these definitions, and then maybe some others in the future. It can help you figure out what something means to know the prefix intra and extra. So outside the cells, the extracellular fluid are things like interstitial fluid, like tissue fluid. It's the fluid that's in the tissue of the body. And then plasma is an example of a extracellular fluid. That's the fluid component of blood. And sometimes when they do a blood test, they'll like spin the blood around in a centrifuge and separate out the plasma. And that's the fluid component, separate from the fluid that's inside of the cells, the blood cells. Other body fluids, such as cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions the brain and spinal cord, those are extracellular fluids. They're just a cushioning, a fluid cushioning around our brain and spinal cord. And so that's extracellular. So let's break that down a little bit more. Our total body water is about 60% or so. Of that, we've got extracellular fluid representing 33% and the intracellular fluid representing 66%. And it lists there some intracellular fluid types. Of the extracellular fluid, we have 25% interstitial fluid, and it lists some types of that. One of them that hadn't been previously mentioned is the fluid in eyes, tears, and the synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is the fluid in your joints. It's in the joints themselves. And then the GI fluids, all that digestive system that we talked about in our last lecture, that whole system has fluid in it, right? So that's a interstitial fluid. And then 8% blood plasma. So next we're going to talk about something called osmosis. So the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane towards the side where the solutes are most concentrated is osmosis. All right, so let's break down that definition, because if you haven't studied osmosis before, it can be a little bit tricky to understand at first. So this water is going to move. It's going to move from one side of a membrane to another. Remember when we looked at the cell, and around the outside of it, it had this kind of wall. It was sort of a circle, right? And it had this kind of wall-like thing around it that, made it a circle. And that's the membrane of a cell, right? That's its membrane, that circular. It was circular in this model that we looked at, outside that holds everything inside, right? So that's a membrane. And this membrane that we're talking about osmosis, is semi-permeable. So permeable means things can go in and out. That's permeable. Things can go in and out. But this is a semi-permeable membrane. So things can go in and out, sort of, but it's not totally just permeable. It's semi-permeable, right? Somewhat permeable. And when water moves across a semi-permeable membrane, it moves towards the side where the solutes are most concentrated. So it's evening things out, okay? So if the solutes are higher on one side, more water is going to move across the membrane to that side where the solutes are more concentrated or highest, okay? And that's a process called osmosis. So osmosis actually helps with something called osmoregulation, which is the movement of water between fluid compartments. That movement happens by osmosis, okay? And it explains here again that osmosis is simply the movement of water through a selectively permeable membrane from an area with that is highly concentrated to an area where it is not so concentrated. And water is never transported actively. This isn't a process that's active. It doesn't take energy to move the water between these compartments when we're talking about osmoregulation, okay? Cells don't control the movement of water directly, but they do control it indirectly. So how does that work? The cells control water movement indirectly. They control solutes, and in doing so, control how water will travel across many selectively permeable membranes. This happens all over the body. So the cells can keep their water volume constant by pumping electrolytes in and out in an effort to balance the concentrations of dissolved particles on either side of the membranes, okay? It doesn't take any energy to do this, the actual movement. So osmoregulation, this is one of the harder concepts to understand. So if you're feeling a little lost, it's okay to feel lost. And I would encourage you to look at the book and really read over this part, because it is kind of hard to understand, and see if by doing it a couple of times it'll sink in. So these are blood cells. This is trying to give you an idea of what osmoregulation is like. So if you have a hypertonic solution, then the cells, these blood cells that are supposed to look like the ones in the middle, basically, they're supposed to look like that. Like kind of like little, I don't know, a little disc with that you've pinched with your finger. That's what they're supposed to look like. So a hypertonic solution, the water is going to go out. In an isotonic solution, you got this going in and out, right? If the cell is in a isotonic solution, you got this natural going in and out that's just kind of normal and keeping everything even. Whereas in that hypertonic solution, you've got all the water going out of the cell and kind of destroying it, making it, just disrupted and destroyed and no longer functional. And then a hypotonic solution, you've got too much water coming in, and that eventually will make the cells pop open and, leak out all their contents, which also destroys them. So when a solution contains an equal concentration of dissolved particles on either side of that membrane, it's known as an isotonic solution. So let me go back. Let's review what isotonic will look like. See, normal. Isotonic's the middle one. That's what blood cells are supposed to look like. Red blood cells are supposed to look like that. It's these other ones that can be dangerous and destroy cells. Okay. So that is really hard. So again, don't feel overwhelmed if it's difficult. It is a difficult part of the fluid balance section. So let's go to something a little bit more straightforward, and that's water's many roles in the body, okay? So we have a role called transportation, and remember that water is the universal solvent. So it provides a lot of transportation in the body. It helps everything gets to where it's supposed to go. Then we have water having a role as a important role in chemical reactions. It's required for reactions. So in order to have those reactions take place, we have to have water. It also serves as a lubricant and a shock absorber many times, and also temperature regulation. And that's come up several times now that water is good for that. All right. Oops. Sorry, I'm a little trouble with my slides. All right, so let's talk about intake and output. So this person is representing intake and output of fluids. So in a day, you'll take in something like 2.2 liters a day of food and drink, okay? Fluids within that food and drink, because some of the food we eat actually has water in it. And so therefore contributes to water coming into our bodies. And then the metabolism also contributes 0.3 liters a day, okay? And you can see down there that formula is showing you how metabolism is contributing to intake. And then we have output. So the skin and lungs actually lose some water every day. That insensible water loss is 0.9 liters per day, okay? It's called the insensible water loss from skin and lungs. And then you also have the urine output, which is the most of our output of water, and that's 1.5 liters per day. And then we have the feces, which contributes a much smaller amount, 0.1 liters per day. And so basically you want this, the intake and the output, to equal 0. That's what you want, because that means the fluid is balanced. And when the fluid is not balanced in the body, things get very bad very fast. At one time, I worked with people who had kidney failure, and so they were not making urine, and among other things, they had a lot of things going wrong. But one of the things that was going wrong is their body wasn't making urine, and so they weren't outputting fluid. And things get really pretty unhealthy, pretty scary, pretty fast when something that big is happening in your body. And it really impacted their health and well-being for sure. And they, without dialysis or some kind of major intervention to get their, if their kidneys could become functional again, or dialysis if they could not, they would die in short order. So fluid balance is just really, really important. Also, another kind of practical thing, when you guys get sick, I often will tell you to drink more fluids when you're sick, because all that coughing and sneezing and fever and sweating from fever, you actually lose more fluids. Plus, you don't want to drink fluids because you don't feel good and maybe it hurts to swallow. The reason I'm telling you that is because fluid balance is so important, and I don't want you to get dehydrated, because I don't want your intake to be so low and your output to be so high that you get dehydrated and feel even worse. So that's a very practical example of a time that we're thinking about fluid balance in the body when someone's reasonably healthy, but they're just, sick for a few days, and it affects their intake and output of fluid. And I even asked a few times, well, is your I hate to ask, but is your urine darker than usual, to try to figure out if people are dehydrated, because their urine will be very concentrated and darker if they are getting dehydrated. And we'll talk in a minute about why that is the case, but that is the case. So water content of foods. So this lists a percentage of water content for various foods, and some of them are really high, like watermelon, which is aptly named, and strawberries have a high water content. Lettuce has a pretty high water content. And then something in the middle might be pizza. It has some water in it, but it's not a really high percentage of water. And then down at the bottom, things like butter, margarine, raisins, not a real high percentage of water. Notice oils and sugars don't have any water in them. So let's talk a minute about regulation of water intake. How does our body kind of regulate how much water we're taking in? How do we know when we need to take in more in order to keep things normal? Well, when our blood volume goes down, our solute concentration goes up, we have a thirst center that gets stimulated. We have decreased saliva secretion in our mouth, and our mouth feels dry, and we have thirst. And that makes us know, I need to drink. I need some water. And when the person does drink water, our blood volume goes up and the solute concentration goes down, and we feel better. So that's a simple way of describing how the regulation of water intake happens. And, some things affect it. For example, as people age, they don't feel as thirsty, and they tend to not drink as much water. And they may not drink as much as they need to because of that. But there's other things that can affect our thirst as well. That's just one example. But mostly the system works pretty well, and we feel the need to drink, and we do drink, and we fix the problem. And then we go about our day for a little longer, and we get thirsty again in a little while when it's time to replenish water again. So let's talk about regulation of water output, which honestly I think is a lot more complicated than input in some ways. This involves a very important, very small gland called the pituitary gland, okay? And you can see there its location. So how this works is when the blood volume goes down and the solute concentration in the blood goes up, antidiuretic hormone is released, okay? So the antidiuretic hormone gets released, and it tells the kidneys to take water back up, to resorb it, okay? Reabsorption of water. As it says, kidneys, don't let go of the water, keep it. And that helps the body conserve water. And guess what happens to our urine when our kidneys do that? Our urine is darker and more concentrated. It's darker because it is more concentrated, right? So if you're getting dehydrated, your body's trying to conserve that water and hold on to it, right? It's regulating your water output to try to keep you hydrated, to try to keep that water in the body. Okay. Okay, now we're just going to touch on this, but it's really beyond the scope of this class to discuss it in depth. But there's something called the sodium potassium pump, okay? And the sodium potassium pump is the primary mechanism for cells to maintain water balance between themselves and their surrounding environment, all right? And we're really not going to talk about it a lot, but you can see that cell membrane there. You can see the high concentration of sodium, the low concentration of sodium, and high concentration of potassium, and that there is movement there between, and that is the sodium potassium pump doing its job to maintain the water balance between the cells. The sodium potassium pump is the main way cells maintain that water balance between themselves and their surrounding environment. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so sodium. Functions of sodium. Maintaining fluid balance is the first one. Sodium is also required for nerve impulse transmission. It's required for nutrient absorption in the small intestine, and it's required for nutrient absorption in reabsorption rather in the kidneys. Okay, so those are some important functions of sodium. Very important. So when we don't have enough sodium in our blood, we get something called hyponatremia. So hypo means low. That prefix means low. And when we have that low blood sodium, some bad things happen. When it occurs, it's usually caused by water intoxication or drinking very large amounts of water. When this happens under sort of normal circumstances, or when endurance athletes are running like a marathon and they drink too much water because it's just such a taxing ordeal to go through, and they're drinking a lot of water, they usually drink way more than they need. And if they're not really careful, they can get water intoxication and they'll get hyponatremia. The blood sodium just gets really, really low. Another time I've heard of this happening, and it was a while ago, but there was a contest for some kind of a video game system that was very coveted and everyone wanted at the time. And it was a radio station doing this contest, and they were going to have people drink as much water as they could in a certain period of time. The one that drank the most water could win this video game system. And they started doing the contest, and it was actually a nurse that called in, and but it could have been any person that was knowledgeable about this. And the person called in and said, this is a really bad idea. This is really, really scary, and it could make someone very, very sick, and tried to kind of warn them. But they didn't listen to that person. They didn't make it onto the air, I don't think. They just called the radio station. And it turns out that the person who was winning the contest ended up having a seizure and dying because of this contest. And so that's why I know this story, is because it's a very sad story that someone actually died because they caused water intoxication because they were trying to compete in this contest that was very unsafe. So but you really have to try to drink a lot of water, to drink so much water that you would have hyponatremia, or be in a situation like the endurance athlete, that you're just your body's in such a state of disarray because it's being put through this incredible challenge that you're craving water that is just abnormal to crave that much water. So under normal circumstances, water intoxication just really doesn't occur very often. But I have seen it, and I think a lot of other people have seen it that have, worked in healthcare, because, and what you see more often is you see people's labs come back and their sodium is just a little low. And so the doctors will want to do something about that to make sure they don't have a problem from it. But to see someone's really low, and they've had a seizure or something. That's pretty rare, but I have seen it. I've seen it several times. And it was surprising, where I was trying to figure out how did that happen. And we usually did. So what is adequate intake of sodium? Well, let's talk about what's adequate intake of anything first. So an adequate intake, and sometimes you'll see that abbreviated AI, is the level of a nutrient intake that should be used as a goal when no RDA exists. So the RDA is like the recommended amounts. And the recommended daily amount is what RDA stands for. And the adequate intake is what we use when we don't even have an RDA. So we're using this adequate intake as a measure. And the value is an approximation of the nutrient intake that sustains health. That's an AI, or adequate intake. So the AI for sodium, you can see here, it's different for different ages of people. And see, it's not even determined for infants. Well, it's actually the adequate intake it's the tolerable upper level that's not determined for infants. Sorry about that. But you can see this tolerable upper intake over there. That's how much we could tolerate, the most we could tolerate. All right, reduced sodium diets are often recommended for people with hypertension or high blood pressure. So if you've ever heard somebody say, oh, I have high blood pressure, I'm not supposed to eat a lot of salt, that's what they're talking about. I just wanted to mention that because that's a practical way that sodium gets emphasized in diets for people with a health condition. All right, so let's talk a minute more about hyponatremia. That's the low blood sodium. These are some other ways that hyponatremia might happen. Excessive sodium loss and or water intake. We talked about water intake already, but you could have sodium loss that caused it too. And you could have both of those happening simultaneously that would cause it too. Sodium levels fall in the blood and in fluid between the cells. That could cause it. Water moves where solutes are more concentrated, so into cells, and then the cells will swell. And that's why things get really dangerous, is when those cells swell, and you can get the nausea, muscle cramps, confusion, seizures, coma, and death. The coma and death part is related to the cell swelling and being destroyed. The seizures, like I said before, like hospitalized people that have been, they've been hospitalized for a seizure and they've never had one before, they're always like checking their sodium because that's a reason that can happen. But before they had the seizure, they might have nausea, muscle cramps, and confusion. And muscle cramps would be really common, with those endurance athletes, they would have that. They might have confusion, nausea before they get to the point that they would have a seizure. And this cell swelling is particularly dangerous for the neurological system, like the brain. All right, sodium in most American diets comes from processed or prepared foods. Did you know that a lot of the sodium in diets come from those processed foods? They really do. So although they're very convenient, they contain a lot of sodium. Some canned foods contain a lot of sodium, like things like convenience meals that you can put in the microwave and heat up. A lot of those contain a lot of sodium. So a lot of the sodium in the diets come from that. And not everyone needs to be on like a low sodium diet, but in general, Americans just eat a lot of sodium. There's other diets in the world that have a lot of sodium in them too. So this is the first time we've seen a nutrition facts label for packaged foods. So I'd like to draw your attention for a moment where that blue arrow is, and that says sodium and lists 160 milligrams of sodium. So sodium is usually listed in milligrams on the food label. So you can see there, if a person was trying to eat a certain amount of sodium per day, they can figure that out from the prepared foods, how much sodium they're getting. Okay, they could add it up for the whole day. They could just look at the store when they're shopping, if they're trying to reduce their sodium intake, and look at how much sodium's in something and choose something that has lower sodium, for example. And so that's ways that the food label can be used. There's also regulation for health claims on food packaging, and sodium's a really good example of some of those regulations. If they use these claims on the left-hand side, the meaning is on the right-hand side. It's what it's supposed to mean. They can't just say whatever they want to anymore. They used to be able to say whatever they wanted to, but now there's regulation and they can't just say whatever they want to. And that helps to make the claims more valid, more true, because, you know, people can be fooled by those claims and might think they're eating healthier than they really are, or eating, if they're trying to lower their sodium in their diet, they think they're doing that, and they're not looking at the food label. They're just looking at the claim on the label, on the package on the front, and you know, was really fooling people and causing them to make mistakes about their food choices when they were really trying. So something like lightly salted has an actual meaning for food labeling. Lightly salted, for example, means 50% or less sodium than that added to a similar food. So it's a lightly salted nuts, okay? It's going to be 50% less sodium than that added to a similar food product. That means it's lightly salted. Low salt means contains less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving. Okay, let's talk about salt substitutes for a minute, because this can be really important for people that are trying to reduce their sodium intake, such as those with high blood pressure that have been told to try to reduce their sodium intake to decrease their blood pressure. So you see there the sodium amount in regular salt for one teaspoon is 2,300 milligrams, okay? And it says potassium 0. And the reason potassium is listed is because some of these salt substitutes have a lot of potassium. And there are people who need to watch their potassium intake. And so they need to know if there's a lot of potassium in what they're consuming as a salt substitute. So Mrs. Dash there, I actually like Mrs. Dash. I think Mrs. Dash is good, but I think it makes things taste good. But the serving size of one teaspoon of Mrs. Dash has 0 sodium and 40 of potassium, 40 milligrams. And some of the others on there, like Morton light salt down there, 1 teaspoon of that has much less sodium than regular salt. It has 1,100. Potassium, it has 1,500 milligrams. And so as you can see, there's just a lot of options for people, and they can make choices based on the concerns that they have in their diet and what their healthcare provider has told them to watch out for and not watch out for, or their dietitian if they've met with a dietitian, which is a great idea in times that we need to change our diets. So they can choose salt substitutes, you know, that work for them so they can reduce their sodium level. Okay. So next we're going to talk about chloride. Chloride is the primary anion in the extracellular fluid. Chloride is needed in the body for several things, including normal osmotic pressure. So we talked about osmosis, normal osmotic pressure. Chloride's needed for that. Normal acid-base balance and normal water balance. So chloride's very important in the body for those things. Just 2/3 teaspoon of table salt per day is sufficient for chloride as well as sodium intake for adults. And so that's not very much. If you've done much cooking, you know that 2/3 teaspoon of table salt is not a lot for seasoning food. Okay. So next we're going to talk about potassium. Potassium is really important as well. Potassium is the most abundant positively charged ion inside of cells. And blood potassium levels can fall into a strict range. Body hormones like insulin and aldosterone help control it to keep it in this tight range because it's very important that it stay there, and we're going to find out why on the next couple slides. All right, so roles for potassium in the body. Potassium is needed for nerve impulses, acid-base balance, the sodium-potassium pump, protein synthesis, energy metabolism, platelet function, and blood buffering. So in the healthcare or the science world, hypo means low, hyper means high. We've already talked about that, but here's a slide that actually visualizes it. So we talked about another hypo before. This is hypokalemia, which means low blood potassium. The causes of hypokalemia are low potassium intake, high sodium intake, and the use of medications that cause the body to excrete water. And that's really the most common cause that you see out in the world, is when people are taking those medications. Sure, you can have somebody have low potassium intake or high sodium intake and have this hypokalemia or low blood potassium, but usually it's because they're taking these medications that are often for high blood pressure, and it'll cause low blood potassium. And sometimes people even have to take potassium supplements by prescription to make sure it doesn't happen. And there are reasons you would want to make sure it doesn't happen, because if you get low blood potassium or hypokalemia, you're going to have muscle weakness and cramps, constipation, and respiratory distress. It's very uncomfortable. Adequate intake of potassium, and you can see there what the adequate intake would be for infants, for children, for adolescents, and for adults. And let's talk for a minute about the opposite, which is hyperkalemia, which is high blood potassium, okay? It is usually caused by kidney dysfunction. The kidneys are not working, they're not doing their job, and you get this high blood potassium as a result. And if it's severe enough, it can disrupt the electrical impulses of the heart and cause death. It actually causes the heart to stop beating if it gets bad enough. But that doesn't happen very often, especially in people who have normal kidney function. We can have enough potassium in our diet by eating bananas, apricots, beans, spinach, avocado, and other foods. Also, it's in multivitamins and things like that. So we want to make sure we get enough potassium, but again, I say it's not usually a problem. All right. So one question I wanted to talk about just at the end of this lecture, while we're talking about the components of the diet that we have just been talking about, is why, when science can supply all the nutrients another way, why do we eat the foods that we eat? What I mean by that is it's actually possible to provide the nutrients people need in like an IV form, where it's intravenously put into the body, or there's certainly ways to do it with tube feeding. So what are the reasons that we wouldn't just do that? I mean, I guess it's sort of a silly question. Obviously, food tastes better. It's more interesting. We have social reasons that we enjoy it, typically. But also, I want to point out that whether science can do this or not, whether it can supply nutrients another way, it is not very safe, and it is very, very complicated. Because, for example, when I was talking a minute ago about IV nutrition for very sick people, or for people whose their digestive system doesn't work and they have to get nutrients through an IV, it is an extremely complicated process. A pharmacist has to like make sure that all of those electrolytes are perfectly balanced, and they have to look at the labs and make sure that the amounts of all the electrolytes that they put in that IV nutrition for the patient is going to be correct and not cause major problems and cell destruction and all kinds of terrible things. Plus, the IV nutrition has like sugar in it. It needs to, right? You know, to have to adequately nourish the body, it needs to have carbohydrates, and that sort of, you know, can be described as sugar basically, because it is in this case. And bacteria like that sugar. It's hard to control blood sugar. The bacteria can like to grow in the sugary IV. I mean, unfortunately, it can be like a risk factor for infection. They can get really sick from an infection and get sepsis and even pass away. So it can be really complicated to try to scientifically replace what is naturally found in the diet and our food that we take in and use. So I just wanted to bring up this question, and I know in the video it's a little bit in this setting it's a little harder to have like a discussion, but to imagine a discussion. But I just want to point out that, you know, this all this complicated work is going on. Our body is doing it all the time, and it's keeping us nourished through food, which is really an amazing process if you think about it. Because when we've tried to replace it with science, when we had to keep someone alive, it's an endeavor. It can be done, but it is not like natural. It's not easy to do, and it's got a lot of risks to it for the patient. Whereas you know, the body does these things naturally. It's really an amazing thing that it nourishes itself through food. So I'll just leave you with that positive thought about nutrition. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.